takes its initial inspiration from the history of the Lee female reformers of 1819. So the monstrous representations of them in the media of the time. So we've been drawing on this symbolism and elements of the reformers' activities, and we're researching and developing work in the Lee community which weaves an empowering language based on a shared history of place, myth, power and witchcraft. So prior to lockdown, we've transformed the turnpike into an enchanted forest ripe for conspiracy, filled with monstrous banners designed and made by the community. So this magical space will be added to throughout our residency with art made by the community and by ourselves. We'll be running online workshops and creative activities which connect people to their history through materials and making. And during lockdown, we are developing our own work at home, which we would have been doing in the space, but we're adapting to that. Our project is a way to engender citizenry and is evolving through participants' interaction and creation. A programme of more events, performances, and later a history walk in real life. Wow, if we can imagine that. Will further explore the sites and history of the reformers and the spectral power in an enfranchised populace. So I want to introduce Dr. Ruth Mather, a historian of gender, class, home and politics in the 18th and 19th century England. So Ruth is born and raised in Blackburn. She retains a particular interest in the history of everyday life in Lancashire cotton towns. So Anna and I read Ruth's essay entitled "These Lancashire Women Are Witches in Politics, Female Reform Societies and the Theatre of Radicalism, 1819 to 1820, during our initial conversations about wanting to work together on a project that connected us to our Lee roots, both being from the town. So we were intrigued by the way that Ruth revealed these women as shapeshifters, using the domestic language of home and family with the militant actions of marching drills and calls to arms. So today Ruth is going to discuss this further in her talk, Wives, Witches, Mothers, Monsters, ? Female Reform Societies and Lancashire Politics in 1819, which will look at the subversive underpinning of seemingly innocent domestic language of the female reformers and the role of symbolism and tradition in their political activism. So I'm going to pass over to Ruth now, and yeah, take it away.
Okay, thanks Helen, and thanks to Anna as well for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be part of this project. As Helen mentioned, I'm from Blackburn, and when I first kind of found out about the female reformers, it was really interesting to me that there were these women that had got involved in politics at an early stage, and were fighting not necessarily for their own right to vote, but for the right of their men to vote, and in the hope that that would kind of improve their lives materially. The exhibition just looks so fabulous, and I'm really hoping that at some point I'm going to be able to actually go in person and kind of walk about in this enchanted forest and, you know, maybe do some conspiring as well, because that sounds really fun. So thank you all for coming as well. It's a Saturday afternoon, so I really appreciate you giving up your time to come and listen to me talk. Hopefully I'll be interesting enough for you all. So my talk today is going to look at the female reformers in the context of a culture war that was raging in Britain, and perhaps especially in the Northwest in 1819. And I think that the context of this kind of culture war helps us see how the female reformers movement, which used what seems on the surface to be quite modest, inoffensive language, came to be perceived as quite threatening by the forces of law and order in Lancashire and beyond, so like the English Home Office as well. Some of you may have had a chance to get to Yvonne Eckersley's talk the other week, so she may have already kind of talked to you a little bit more about who the female reformers were. But just as a little bit of background, these were groups of women that emerged on the political scene in the summer of 1819, and they were appearing at meetings of radicals. So these were people that were often from kind of lower middle or working class background, and what they wanted was representation in Parliament for people that didn't have property, and they were kind of tying their lack of representation in Parliament to the kind of poverty and the sort of deprivation they saw around them. So that's kind of who this movement are. So the first female reform society to appear were in Blackburn. They appeared at a meeting and presented the chairman with an embroidered cap of liberty and an address, which he proceeded to read to the assembled company. This was the pattern which most of the female reform societies followed. So they would read and then later publish in the kind of radical newspapers, very highly kind of stylized addresses. And these were accompanied by very ritualized presentations. I'll talk a little bit more about the presentations later. And in all of these addresses, female reformers emphasised very domestic themes. They talked about the impoverished state of their homes and the emotional toll of caring for a family in poverty. The Blackburn Female Reformers address informed the audience that our houses, which once bore ample testimony of our industry and cleanliness, and were fit for the reception of a prince, are now, alas, robbed of all their ornaments, and our beds that once afforded us cleanliness, health, and sweet repose are now torn away from us by the relentless hand of the unfeeling tax gatherer. And they went on to say that language can't paint the feelings of a mother when she beholds her naked children and hears their inoffensive cries of hunger and approaching death. So it's quite dramatic, but it's kind of all about kind of raising a family in poverty. Manchester's female reformers echoed similarly emotional appeals. So they stated that we can no longer bear to see numbers of our parents immured in workhouses, our fathers separated from our mothers in direct contradiction to the laws of God and man, our sons degraded below human nature, our husbands and little ones clothed in rags and pining on the face of the earth. And the Manchester women were explicitly seeking support from women higher up the social status. So they addressed their speech to the wives, mothers, sisters and daughters of the higher and middling classes of society. So on the face of it, that all seems quite innocuous. It's radical women who are appealing to other women on the basis of kind of shared experience as homemakers. And some of the historians that have studied the female reformers have tended to see their addresses as being quite deliberately bland. So they were emphasising very sort of traditionally feminine subjects in order to deflect criticism because they were partaking in a very unfeminine activity of participating in politics. So Paul Custer suggested that the female reformers were equally famous for their novelty and their unoriginal rhetoric, the latter designed mainly as a tranquiliser against the former. And Anna Clark stated that women had to use modest language because they faced vitriolic attacks for their activities. So when I kind of came to look at these addresses, I thought, well, if they were trying to speak about domesticity to avoid criticism, they were failing pretty spectacularly. They received a lot of criticism. And this is from the very start as well, so they kind of knew that this was coming. So the newspaper Truman's Exeter Flying Post declared that the females are well known to be the most abandoned of their sex. And this was the theme that was echoed in caricatures as well. So I'll share one of these with you. Bear with me while I keep changing the screen as well. Still getting used to kind of speaking on Zoom. So this is by J.L. Marks. It's a caricature from the British Museum's collection, which is fantastic. If you ever get a chance to just have a day kind of browsing through the caricatures in there, they're fantastic. But this is called A Reform Among Females, and it uses very kind of lewd double entendre to twist the words of the female reformers' address. So Alice Kitchen, who's kind of here in the middle, is saying, I feel great pleasure in holding this thingumbob in my hand as we see our sweethearts and husbands are such fumblers at the main thing. We must of course take the thing in our own hands. A reform is very much wanted among us, although we should not put on armour or carry guns, it's my opinion. We should be stark naked. We could make a whole army stand. It's our duty as wives to assist our husbands in every push and turn. And you can kind of see how this is backed up by the women sort of spilling out of their dresses a bit, and they've got their hands and their kind of banner poles at very suggestive angles. Within the crowd, there's a man just down here at the front groping a woman, and he's saying, I feel for your sex. And towards the back, there's a very, you can't kind of see it very well on the slide, but there's a very unoriginal sexist remark, which is someone saying, come home and get dinner ready, I'll reform you. So yeah, sexists haven't changed their jokes very much in the last 200 years. But the caricaturist is having really great fun at the expense of the women, and by doing so is very much undermining the sincerity of what they're trying to say. Another caricature, so this one's from the Manchester Comet, and this supposedly shows a meeting of female reformers at Manchester's union rooms, and this time they're being shown as being drunks. So there's bottles at the front, one of them's broken. A lot of the women are kind of swigging their drinks and waving their cups in the air. And there's also a little bit of sexual impropriety going on as well. So there's this woman in the corner having a bit of a public display of affection there. There's a man hiding under the table, perhaps spying on the women. Part of the joke as well is this, these boxes at the front, which are labelled breakfast powder. That was something that was produced by the radical orator Henry Hunt as part of a campaign to abstain from taxable goods like beer and spirits. So the joke there is that the women clearly aren't sticking to their principles. So again, it's kind of undermining their sort of political commitment. We get a sense that even when they were weaving together political ideas and everyday feminine domestic testimony, women's political insights weren't being taken seriously, and instead their characters, and particularly their sexual morality, were put under attack. In the J.L. Marx caricature that we looked at first, I do think it's interesting that the women aren't kind of made grotesque. Perhaps they're actually supposed to be a little bit titillating for the viewer as well, so he's perhaps also kind of emphasising that about them. And I think that this response reflects concerns that women did have sexual power. They could use that to influence men. So this was a possibility that was raised at a radical meeting. One of the speakers encouraged women to withhold sexual favours from their sweethearts and husbands if they weren't going to be active in the reformist cause. So it's this kind of idea of the sex strike. And on the opposite side of the political spectrum, a correspondent to the Literary Chronicle worried that the men are stirred up by the women who look only to rebellion and not to industry for relief. So this is the presentation of women as sirens. They're kind of tempting men away from their work and into the dangerous business of radicalism. So it's kind of fears of women's sexual power. Other sources suggested that women weren't just dangerous in terms of what they might encourage men to do, but also in terms of what they might do themselves. So just to show another image for you. This one's by George Cruikshank. Oh, sorry, I'm not shared it yet. There we go. This one's by George Cruikshank, and it's a depiction of the female reformers of Blackburn again. There are kind of elements of sexual suggestiveness in this, but it's got kind of far more violent themes to it. So the women are wearing the breeches just to show that they kind of claim masculine power. Some of them are holding daggers. This baby up here has got 2 daggers. And this woman here is kind of dangling her baby under her arm like she might drop it. So they're kind of unnatural mothers, kind of training their children in violence. These women aren't kind of supposed to be alluring at all. They're grotesque, they're threatening. Pretty much everybody in the image also kind of represent, they look very similar to the kind of visual imagery of French revolutionaries. So this is just an example of a caricature of French revolutionaries. You can see they've got the liberty caps, which again are being worn on this image by a lot of the radicals, including the babies. And the caps of liberty, which are these red caps, that's what was presented by women at the meetings. So those had French revolutionary connotations as well. And if we then kind of think about the fact that it was Parisian market women that led the March on Versailles in 1789, you start to see how kind of groups of women that potentially had kind of revolutionary feeling might be quite threatening to people in authority. I'll just have a quick drink. It's the context of the French Revolution and then the wars against France that I think underpins female reforms activity. So the Reform Societies emerged in 1819. This is only 4 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The French Revolution in 1789 had initially been welcomed by many people in Britain. They saw it as an echo of Britain's own so-called glorious revolution that had happened just over a century earlier. And then others also kind of welcomed the spread of ideas about democracy and equality. The early 1790s saw the development of a movement in Britain for parliamentary reform, and this, for the first time, started to include working people as well as the middle and upper classes. And so it had the potential to become a mass movement. So this was groups such as the London Corresponding Society, which sought to educate ordinary people about political ideas and link them to these everyday hardships that they experienced. So they were trying to demonstrate this link between kind of material deprivation and a lack of representation in Parliament. And from this kind of London Corresponding Society, there were offshoots all over the country. They kind of formed divisions, so you kind of get a group to a certain size and then it split and form a new group. So it kind of seemed like it was endlessly reproducing itself. And at the same time as this, France then establishes a republic. They execute the royal family. Britain goes to war with France. And then with all these kind of groups endlessly multiplying, calling for reform, you can start to see that the British radicals started to kind of be equated with French revolutionaries in the minds of the establishment. And from the 1790s onwards, there develops this sort of culture war between radicals and what we call loyalists. So these are the people that were kind of loyal to the established political order as it was. And just to kind of mention as well that that wasn't just people that were in power. So there were kind of working class people that wanted to keep things as they were. They wanted to keep the status quo. And that was largely influenced by the French Revolution. So kind of disquiet about what was going on over there. So both sides in this culture war were trying to claim that they were true representatives of what we might think of as being the British values of the time. They claimed to be patriots, protectors of the vulnerable, hardworking and morally upstanding. And this is a culture war that continued into the 1810s. So this is what I think is kind of underpinning the Female Reform Society's emergence. Why I think this is because one of the key battlegrounds within this war of ideas was the home. The idea of home is central to English national identity in this period. So if you think of the phrase, an Englishman's home is his castle, that encapsulates the idea that private liberties shouldn't be being interfered with by anyone in power. It's an idea of individual liberty. The household was also the model for political organisation. So the king was supposed to be understood as the father of his people, and he's exercising authority over his subjects, but in the kind of benevolent way as a father would to his children. And the other thing that's starting to emerge is this idea of domestic comfort that we kind of associate with the Victorians, but is sort of seeing its origins here. So the radical weaver Samuel Bamford from Middleton wrote in his memoir that in England alone is the term home, with all its domestic comforts and associations, properly understood. So we get the sense that in the minds of English people, at least, there's something kind of very English about the idea of home, and it had a very important sort of symbolic and emotional appeal. So wartime propaganda for the wars against France appealed to this love of home to recruit men from all ranks of society. They were kind of suggesting that, you know, every man has a home, every man has a family to protect. So every man has a kind of duty to stand up. Satirical prints represented the French home as being disordered and deprived and showed family relationships breaking down. And this was contrasted with very idealised cosy cottage scenes to suggest that the English home was a place of peace and plenty that needed to be preserved. Again, I'll just show you an example of that because I do love my caricatures. So in this one, you can see the kind of French revolutionary home is sort of bare, the children are starving, gnawing on bones, while in the cosy kind of English cottage, you've got John Bull and his family sitting down to roast beef dinner. Everyone looks kind of plump and healthy. You know, they've got plenty to eat, everyone looks happy, everyone looks peaceful, they've got loads of kind of stuff decorating their house. So yeah, it's kind of suggesting that you've got it pretty good in Britain. Would you really want to kind of have this alternative that they have in France? And a lot of that kind of idea that French homes were disordered came from early on in the French Revolution. Divorce was legalised. It was kind of rolled back on later, but there was this idea at the start that women might also have equality, and that so family relationships might also be kind of changed by political change. Ideas about gender were also central to the propaganda that encouraged men to enlist. So in the early 18th century, English people had tended to be quite suspicious of standing armies, which could be kind of used to oppress people on their own soil. There was a much kind of greater cultural preference for the navy, which could only kind of deal with trouble abroad. But the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars required vast numbers to fight the French. And so we get this sort of shift in perceptions between soldiers as being kind of hirelings that might be used against the English people, to being these kind of heroic models of manliness. They were seen as kind of defenders of the vulnerable, and in that category they would have placed women. And they get this sort of chivalric presentation of military men. So English soldiers were being portrayed as protecting home, and especially the women and children that lived in the home, from a potential French invasion. And French soldiers, by contrast, were being portrayed as particularly sort of sexually dangerous, so posing a particular danger to women. And the historian Linda Carley says in her book Britons that part of national identity, part of the reason kind of women bought into it, was this sense that they were safe in Britain. The home and the family were kind of recognised and safe concepts, which is not necessarily the case, as the female reformers will probably argue, but it kind of shows this sort of importance of the idea of home. Because radicals were seen as being sympathetic to the French, they therefore had to kind of contest against all these negative portrayals. And working class radicals in particular had to contend with the idea that they were motivated by politics of envy. They wanted state handouts instead of, kind of working for what they needed. And again, there's kind of an extra dimension of this for working class women who were accused that basically their opponents were saying to them that they'd be better served by focusing on their home and family rather than dealing with politics. So cheap repository tracts were kind of cheap, mass-produced reading material aimed at the working classes, and they had very simple moralising messages. And one of these, published in 1819, had a character that said, "Since our debutante speechmaker, the children are all in rags and I can't get a clean shirt." So yeah, poor guy. Anyway, so this might all feel quite abstract, but these were debates that had real world implications for radicals in Lancashire. So there's a real atmosphere of intimidation against suspected radicals. So early on in the 1790s, Effigies of Thomas Paine, who wrote The Rights of Man, which had kind of inspired a lot of radical groups, his effigy was kind of ceremonially burned in a lot of towns. There were at least 26 of these Paine burnings within about a 20-mile radius of Manchester. And these were often accompanied by a mock treason trial, and then large crowds would kind of drag the effigy through the streets. So if you're kind of on the streets and kind of sympathise with Thomas Paine's ideas, you might feel a bit intimidated by that. Loyalists also established their own associations, such as the Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levellers, which was a largely working class organisation which was famed for its intimidation of suspected radicals. They declared that their purpose was to preserve and transmit to their children that constitution and domestic happiness which they received from their ancestors and which has always distinguished them above all the other nations on earth. So again, you're seeing this claim that domestic happiness is a very British thing. I guess other countries would have disputed that, but this is kind of how British people saw themselves. So these groups monitored radical activity, and in some areas they went door to door demanding that inhabitants sign petitions of loyalty to the king. So that happened to William Blake in his kind of Lambeth neighbourhood, but this was also going on in kind of Manchester and the surrounding area. So radicals might also not feel very safe within their own homes as well as on the streets. In 1795, 2 Acts of Parliament expanded the definition of treason and placed restrictions on public meetings, and then there were harsher sentences as well for people that were found guilty. So radicals had quite good reason to fear being kind of outed as radicals as well. they were kind of potentially facing a lengthy prison sentence or even transportation. And this was a sense of intimidation that was heightened during invasion scares during the wars. So between 1797 and 1798, and then again between 1803 and 1805, there were very real fears that the French might actually invade Britain. And radicals in Britain were then kind of seen as potentially sympathetic to the French and potentially kind of traitorous insiders. So in response to this invasion threat, volunteer regiments marched across the country, and these helped loyalists to feel that they were actively defending their local area against a real military threat. These militia units were used also against local populations that dared to protest against things like rising food prices or poor working conditions. So, for example, Luddite gatherings, so one in Middleton was dispersed by the military, and also striking weavers at St George's Fields in Manchester in 1808. That was a very kind of violent militia violent militia dispersal of that meeting as well. So radicals knew that their public gatherings and protests might be met with physical force, and this is something that we'll come to very soon when we talk about Peterloo. So if I return now to 1819, the war years remained a fresh memory for the female reformers when they were making these addresses. So their speeches actually referred to the wars as one of the causes of their deprivation. The Manchester female reformers referred to the late, unjust, unnecessary and destructive war against the liberties of France, which they claimed had tended to raise landed property threefold above its value and to load our beloved country with such an insurmountable burden of taxation. They argued that the war had annihilated commerce and it had driven Lancashire's inhabitants to poverty and degradation. So it seems to me that the female reformers were deliberately countering the loyalist assertion that the loyalists were the guardians of domestic happiness. And instead they were arguing that war and government corruption had reduced their homes to something more like that kind of French revolutionary image. They'd been impoverished by it. So they kind of were claiming that they didn't have access to the kind of cosy cottage that was being kind of promoted as the British ideal. The extent of the deprivation that they described was probably a little bit exaggerated for effect, but the point was to show that, you know, not all Britons were able to partake in this kind of cosy domesticity that was being promoted. And if the king was the father of his nation, perhaps he was failing to adequately provide for his children. And the fact that this testimony was coming from women, so those most associated with kind of making and looking after the home, lent it much more authenticity. And I think that this idea that the female reformers were reclaiming domesticity for the radical movement as part of an ongoing battle for ownership of shared values makes more sense if we look at what they were actually doing at the same time as they were making these speeches. So the female reformers of Blackburn presented the chairman at that first meeting that they appeared at with an embroidered cap of liberty as well as with the address. And the Stockport female reformers likewise planned to make a cap to present, and the Manchester female reformers planned to do this at a meeting at St Peter's Fields on August the 16th, 1819, so that's what turned into Peterloo. So it looks like quite a subservient gesture on the first glance. It's women kind of presenting these elaborate handmade gifts to the men that are leading the movement. But if we look back again at this wartime context, we can see that a similar ritual was enacted between women and those volunteer militias that I talked about earlier, who were supposed to protect the nation from both the French and from British traitors. So an example of this from 1799 took place at Ashton-under-Lyne. Lady Stamford and Mrs. Hayes presented a banner to the newly formed volunteer regiment. And this was accompanied by a song which celebrated the men's efforts against both the French and what they called the regicide hosts and the demons of faction at home. So by that they meant the radicals. And it was a parallel that was explicitly noted by the radical journalist William Cobbett. So he wrote to the female reformers saying, "It is notorious that the several militia regiments have had their ensigns, their emblems, their banners presented to them by titled women all over the country. These women came, like you, out into the open air among crowds of men. They there, like you, made addresses to the men. They, like you, exhorted the men to stand bravely by the emblems they presented." So the female reformers were consciously mimicking and perhaps even mocking these rituals that were associated with loyalist women and with a militia that had been embodied in part to suppress people that shared their politics. They also spoke of the caps of liberty that they presented in similar terms to military standards, which kind of can't be deserted on the field of battle. So the female reformers handed over their cap in the trust that no ruffian banditti will be allowed to wrest it from your hands, but with the forfeiture of your existence. The Stockport female reformers had decided to make their own cap, and they claimed that they would bring it victoriously back again or lose our lives in its defence. So what we have is women not only covering the same ground as loyalist recruitment propaganda, but also echoing the sorts of rituals which accompanied the establishment of armed militias. And then they're also kind of speaking about this willingness to die for a cause. So you can kind of begin to see how this might have looked quite threatening to Lancashire's magistrates and to the Home Office as well. And alongside talking about their homes and families, female reformers also used more militant language on their own behalf. So the female reformers address stated that we cannot boast much of female courage, although we're not without proof in history of women who've led armies to the field and carried conquest before them. While the Manchester women threatened that it wasn't possible to kind of bear the weight of their oppression any longer, they kind of referred to that as their chains. They said that they must tear them asunder and dash them in the face of their remorseless oppressors. And elsewhere, spies were reporting that more militant activity was taking place among radical women. So one informant stated that women were going about from house to house begging for money to make caps of liberty. They say in public they'll begin with the branches and cut them all down until they come to the ball. And the meaning of that is that they'll murder all of their neighbours who are against their purpose. So again, this perhaps mirrors the action of the loyalist associations, this idea of kind of going door to door, intimidating people. Although it's always kind of worth being aware that spies were paid for their information, so they kind of had this motivation to exaggerate a little bit. The Morning Post newspaper also reported that a female reformer was training inhabitants in Lee to make pikes, and there were fears that radicals were stockpiling weapons for a future revolution. Again, that might have been designed to sell newspapers rather than anything else, but there was kind of this underlying air of tension that something might happen. The radical movement as a whole did tend to emphasise commitment to peaceful constitutional change in public, but the use of military ritual and the repurposing of propaganda previously used against the French might have suggested more militaristic intentions, which added fuel to kind of alarmist rumours that were circulating. So I'm not arguing that the female reformers or kind of the radicals much more generally did definitely kind of plan to use violence, but it was this ambiguity about what they did intend that was unsettling magistrates and the kind of central Home Office as well. They were in kind of constant correspondence with the local magistrates. So the female reformers alternated between presenting themselves as kind of modest and domestic and strong and determined, and it's perhaps this kind of shape-shifting quality that provoked one of the spies at a meeting in Lee to comment that these Lancashire women are witches in politics. To me, this kind of resonates with the idea that witches were often poor women who had very little power. What power they had was probably kind of psychological. It was kind of in unsettling people that upset them and kind of psychological kind of causing them to worry so much that they often made themselves ill. And this is perhaps that kind of same power that's being used by the female reformers. It's the power to unsettle someone when you don't have very much power to do anything else. Okay, so what did this mean for the female reformers? So these monstrous depictions of them as nymphomaniacs or drunks or sans-culottes or witches, it all served to kind of defeminize them and dehumanize them. So their opponents saw them as no longer deserving the kind of respect that might traditionally have been paid to the so-called fairy sex. They'd kind of been robbed of these qualities of kind of delicacy and, gentleness, modesty. They were kind of being portrayed as not possessing that kind of female quality. Instead, they were seen as being threatening inversions of the social order, and they were exercising power over men through violence or sexuality. So they actually became targets when the military rode in to disperse a radical meeting at St Peter's Fields in Manchester on August 16th, 1819. So many of you will already be kind of aware of Peterloo. It was a mass meeting to call for political reform. The radicals had hoped that their strength in numbers and their kind of peaceful, orderly conduct would make a kind of moral case that couldn't be denied that reform was needed and that they should be kind of represented in Parliament. Radical groups from towns all around Lancashire and Cheshire assembled and marched to St Peter's Fields with music and banners, and many of them were marching in step. And women were also accompanying these marches. The radical orator Henry Hunt was due to speak, but a warrant for his arrest was issued, and the local magistrates, fearing disorder, sent in the Manchester Yeomanry to disperse the crowd. And the result of that is kind of well known as being kind of chaos and brutality. There were at least 15 deaths, and several people were injured. It was in the hundreds of people were injured, and it's probably an underestimate because a lot of people wouldn't have dared kind of seek help, just because of the kind of climate of oppression that was going on around that. So the female reformers were specifically targeted at Peterloo. The historian Michael Bush has done really rigorous research into kind of attendance and casualties at the meeting, and he found that a disproportionate number of women, kind of compared to those in attendance, received sabre wounds, so kind of deliberate wounding with the yeomanry sabres. And these were often also face and on their breasts. So it's this idea that they're kind of deliberately being disfigured by the military. A ballad sheet was published, which was kind of celebrating the actions of the Manchester Yeomanry, and that applauded the violence with the lines, "Hunt's mistress sent to hospital for her face to renew, for she got it closely shaven on the plains of Peterloo." Again, this is kind of linking women's participation with potential sexual impropriety. So it's suggesting that the women that were around Henry Hunt were motivated by kind of sexual desires rather than their political principles, and using that as justification for this violence, and sort of disfiguring their face, or perhaps trying to rob them of this sexual power that women were thought to have. Anne Scott, the wife of a local boat builder, was arrested in Deansgate on the evening of the 16th of August, and that was on a charge of endeavouring to excite the people to commit an assault. And she was unable to pay bail, so she was imprisoned in Manchester's New Bailey. And a publication entitled The Cap of Liberty highlighted her plight, stating that the partisans of government are ever holding up to public view the horrors of the French Revolution, and cautioning the people of England to beware such sanguinary scenes. And yet, while with one hand they're penning these precepts of prudence and morality, with the other they're acting over again the Robespierrean part of universal massacre. So again, this is the explicit reversal of wartime propaganda that had previously been used against radicals. And this idea that, you know, the loyalist establishment were the ones that would protect women. The violence against women in particular was a real theme of newspaper reports and satirical prints that were sympathetic to the radicals. The kind of defining image of Peterloo is this woman being trampled by the cavalryman's horse. And again, I'm going to show you another image. Oh. So on this image, you can see that there's kind of an innocent child urging the soldier not to hurt his mummy. And she looks to be kind of fainting as she's getting the sabre brandished right in her face. Interestingly, this image is by George Cruikshank, who also produced the very grotesque image of the female reformers. So perhaps the shock of this kind of direct targeting of women was enough to change his opinion of them, because this second print is clearly quite a lot more sympathetic. But yeah, you can see the kind of young children as well as women at the front. So this idea that soldiers were protecting the vulnerable is kind of not at all tenable when you kind of see this sort of image. So a number of radical leaders were put on trial in 1820 for sedition for their roles in organising the Peterloo meeting. And the prosecutors sought to establish that the meeting had violent or revolutionary intent. And in particular, they focused on the way that radicals had approached St Peter's Fields. So the argument was that the reformers had marched in step with music and banners, and that this had resembled a military regiment. So added to this was the fact that in the weeks before the meeting, radicals had assembled on the moors around Manchester to practice marching in time and conducting kind of military-style drills to do that. The witnesses for the defence argued that the presence of women and children was evidence of the peaceful intent of the meeting. These witnesses included a 65-year-old woman called Nancy Prestwich, who'd headed one of the processions, and a woman called Lucy Morville, who she was saying that she felt that the meeting was going to be safe. She brought her 2 children for that purpose. But women weren't necessarily seen as a guarantee of non-violence. They'd been active in food riots and in Luddite activity in the area previously. And kind of with that and the kind of more militant language of some of the female reformers and this kind of echoing of military ritual, it was perhaps the participation of women that also kind of contributed to the alarm that some of the observers felt. And again, I don't want to suggest that the meeting wasn't intended to be peaceful, because I think it probably was. But the kind of power of the mass gathering was always that it kind of demonstrated a potential force in numbers. There's also, the radicals did kind of rebel in confusing the local authorities with regard to their intentions. So newspapers around this time reported a number of kind of hoaxes where local magistrates had been informed by someone that they'd kind of either uncovered an arms stash, or they were going to burn an effigy of the local magistrate on the moors, and then kind of send constables running to kind of go and check this out and find out that there's nothing going on. So you do get the kind of sense that they are kind of playing with, you know, what little power they have to some extent around this time. So it was a system that didn't have very many avenues for working class people to exercise power. And while overall they probably intended to be peaceful, this was kind of one way that you could disrupt the elite, basically, and kind of humiliate them to some extent. Is one small way of claiming power back. So I'll come to a finish soon, because I've kind of been talking at you for quite a while now. But I'll just talk a little bit first about what happened after Peterloo. So female reform societies did persist after Peterloo, and they continued in particular to kind of publicise the brutal treatment of women on and after the event. So groups of female reformers continued to appear at radical meetings, although these declined to some extent in 1820 as a ban was placed on meetings of more than 50 people. This was kind of a deliberate attempt to kind of repress radical meetings. There was a kind of more general atmosphere of persecution. A number of radical leaders were imprisoned. There were a series of kind of tough laws brought in to stop kind of publication of radical writing as well. So the movement was forced underground to some extent in 1820. Women in the radical movement during this time continued to play an important role on an everyday basis. So I mentioned previously there was a campaign to starve the Treasury of Revenue by abstaining from taxable goods. And a number of radicals also vowed not to shop at establishments that were owned by their opponents. So these were kinds of consumer activism that were often seen as a way for women who were perhaps seen as being most involved in tasks like shopping and cooking to continue to participate in politics. And perhaps the most kind of famous precedent for that is the sugar boycott of kind of West Indian sugar in the 1780s. So it's this kind of awareness that you kind of use your consumer power to try and enact change. Women also sought to educate their children in radical principles. So again, we can kind of see how children at a meeting might not have been seen as non-threatening, but rather be seen as a way of kind of educating your children about radicalism. The female reformers of Blackburn had vowed to instill in the minds of our offspring a deep-rooted abhorrence of tyranny. And the Halifax female reformers, so just to kind of quickly stray into Yorkshire, they vowed that in our domestic capacity, with the suckling at the breast and the stripling at the hand, the air they inhale should be filled with the principles of reform. There were kind of like tools published for parents to teach their children about radicalism. Yvonne might have talked about these because I know she's written about them, but there's things like a kind of alphabet that was sort of king and tyrant and that sort of thing that was designed for kind of teaching your children about reform. Some parents sent their children to school in white hats like Henry Hunt's to kind of symbolise their support, and some even kind of named their children after radical leaders. So there's a Peterloo anniversary event in 1821 where a radical reverend baptised 8 Henry Hunts and 1 Henrietta Hunt as well. So, you kind of get the sense that they're kind of bringing up the next generation. In 1819, one family even had a Napoleon. So it's kind of an ongoing reminder of the importance of the war in people's cultural memory. And these were everyday forms of radicalism, which related again to the home. It's again a way that women were able to use their experience of domestic management, of raising a family, both to kind of form and express their political ideas. A fresh series of female Reform Society addresses were published in 1820 during the trial of Queen Caroline. So I think we're probably around the bicentenary of that at the moment. This was George IV's estranged wife, and and she was, they tried to remove her title on the basis that she had an affair not just with a man that wasn't her husband, but that this man was also kind of very much below her social status. He was kind of one of her retinue. So there's kind of a social class element there as well that seemed to be inappropriate. The female reformers tied the cruel treatment of Caroline to the barbarity at Peterloo. So the Manchester female reformers wrote to Caroline stating that, as the chiefs of a cruel and corrupt system have levelled their menaces at you, so have the drawn sabres and fixed bayonets of their armed satellites been brandished at us. And the chairwoman argued that when the character of a defenceless and injured woman was at stake, whether it was the queen in the palace or the peasant in the cottage, it ought to call forth the united efforts of her sex to shield her from harm. So the solidarity here is on the basis of an attack on a woman's character, something that the female reformers were all too familiar with. The Queen was kind of very much depicted by her opponents as being very sloppy in her manners and also voracious in her sexual appetites. So, as with the female reformers, transgressions against kind of very classed and gendered norms have brought about this vitriolic response. And again, it kind of showed how women that stepped outside accepted roles were seen as being very kind of threatening or monstrous. So I'm going to finish there and hand over if any of you have any questions.
Thanks so much for that. That was amazing, Ruth. I think if anybody does have any questions, pop them in the chat, and Anna's going to have a little look at those questions. We've got a few questions.
Yeah, I'll just quickly do just one of the questions before we start ours, Ruth. Ruth, Helen. So too many names now. It's just in the, I think it must be the depiction of the reformers where they're kind of roasting the baby. Harriet Monkhouse has asked this question. She can correct me if it wasn't that print, but she said, is the man under the table John Saxton, the husband of Susanna Saxton? She thinks that Robert Poole might have said that, but she might be misremembering.
Is this the Manchester Comet one, the one where they're kind of drinking? Is it?
I'm not quite sure. It was quite...
Yeah, there's a man under the table in the meeting room.
The black and white one. I think it's this one. I'll just show it again. Yeah, so this one. It could be John Saxton, because Susanna Saxton was one of the leaders of the Manchester Female Reform Society. So yeah, it could well be. If anybody knows, it'll be Robert Poole. He kind of knows it better than anybody. So he's possibly right there.
Well, I'm going to ask a question. There's a lot of symbolism used against the female reformers that you've described in media and in prints and in like the Home Office reports and things like that, like these Lancashire women are witches in politics. But a lot of them were based on like Greek myths and a language understood by those like elites who were educated and studying the classics. Would the working class people of Britain have understood the origins or this kind of symbolism? Was it kind of like common parlance, or was it like, was it reserved for those people? Was it kind of like, how was that
for the elites, and kind of like a language that the elite were kind of whispering amongst themselves, particularly more like the kind of overarching activities that were happening in some of the other prints that were more about reform in general? So that we've got toppling sort of statues, and there's things like screaming geese, kind of like representing the kind of the geese that kind of like announced the fall of Rome and stuff like that.
I think people did have a sort of sense of these kind of things. Because I'm always kind of very struck by the fact that the reformers' own addresses and things do kind of reference a lot of more biblical imagery, which they probably would have heard at church, but there does seem to be this awareness of things like the Hydra is one that comes up quite a lot. So it does seem to be kind of a popular language where people did have some sense of some of these kind of classical myths and things. Whether they would have understood it to the same extent as people that, would have kind of studied the classics, I'm not sure. But there were kind of cheap print editions of a lot of things. Samuel Bamford talks about kind of going and buying a lot of sort of sensational cheap prints. Some of the myths and things might well have been kind of published in that form. Ballads as well would be one way that sort of thing would be disseminated among people that weren't necessarily literate. So the stories kind of maybe adapted, and because I think the kind of Greek myths and things are very they're kind of quite lively, and so it's the sort of thing that would adapt well to a ballad, these kind of heroic myths and things. So I don't have any kind of particular examples that I can think of off the top of my head of them using that, but they may well have been aware of it just because of the sort of the sheer kind of variation of references they use themselves. And of course, they've got some kind of classical references that reformers have, not necessarily in what they're writing, but they wore laurel wreaths quite a lot, so it's kind of a symbol of regeneration in classical thinking. And the Liberty Cap itself is kind of going back to kind of philosophers' caps. So yeah, I don't know if everybody involved would have got all of the kind of symbolism, but there was this kind of the kind of Roman Republic in particular was sort of seen as being a kind of important kind of touching point for, I guess, a growing British Empire at that time. And yeah, and popular histories and things might well have touched on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, like, even just like reading those caricatures or the satirical prints, there's so many, like, for somebody in 2020 reading them, it's like there's a lot of things that we would miss, and there's a lot of things that we have to sort of unpick and decipher. And I wonder as well whether there is that, like you say, there's like layers of understanding potentially, like there's probably the odd like ha within those things for people in certain positions of power as well. Yeah, you've spoken about how the Blackburn female reformers referred to historical precedents for female conquest. Can you elaborate on what precedents they were using? Did these precedents have mythical dimensions? Like, well, we kind of said Joan of Arc, even though she wasn't mythical, but there was
to say she's myth or real, because she
yeah.
So again, there's kind of biblical references that they make. So they talk about the siege of Jerusalem and kind of women devouring their own children. They don't actually kind of say in that address which kind of historical precedents they're talking about, but a later pamphlet, I think produced around the time of Queen Caroline by William Benbow, refers to Boudica. So this was probably kind of a figure that they might have been thinking about. And that was kind of tying the Queen Caroline thing to Boudica kind of avenging kind of her ill treatment. And that was kind of used as a bit of an inspiration for female reformers as well, I think. So yeah, they don't actually kind of name their historical precedents. But yeah, it would be interesting to think if they had thought of Joan of Arc, particularly kind of French war kind of context that there is going on.
I mean, like the Joan of Arc thing actually came from, it might have been an article in the Black Dwarf, but it was one of the male reformers writing in reference to the female reformers and saying that they sort of stood as like Joan of Arc's. But I can't exactly remember. We've read so many bits and bats. I can't remember where.
I feel like the name Joan of Arc has come up, but.
It was an interesting reference that he was making, because we were thinking that she was obviously burned as a witch. You know, she had her own problems, but that he'd kind of like given them this sort of like shroud of identity, whereas like the other kind of like negative reports about them were calling them a Medusa or whatever. So it was like they were kind of using this symbolic language, but I wondered if they'd referenced them themselves.
No. I mean, the other one they come up with, not so much the female reformers themselves, but the way they're described is Amazons. And that's often used in quite a kind of approving sort of way. So the male reformers quite often kind of refer to Amazons in almost this kind of like, almost kind of impressed by them. So it's not necessarily a negative thing.
Yeah, it's funny that I was reading one the other day because we ploughed through so many newspaper archives when we were originally looking at doing our research, and there was references to things like Amazons and different sort of groups of people in both contexts, like both negatively and positively. So like you could use the same myth and pull somebody apart for it, or commend them for it as well. which was quite interesting.
Yeah, and that's something you see with very much with the witches one, because kind of the Lancashire witches is kind of a toast to women's beauty in Lancashire, as the kind of sense that they're bewitching, but also you kind of see it used in a sort of more negative sense as well. So that's a bit of an ambiguous compliment, I guess.
Yeah, because they say, because the full quote is, if not in beauty, in what is it now? It's like, these Lancashire women are witches in politics, if not in beauty. So was that term a witch more about bewitching and something, because we kind of read that as a negative term instantly, a negative, like a slur, but was it in any way considered a positive?
Yeah, so it's quite,
but in common parlance.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of toasts, and I think it must just have been a kind of traditional Lancashire toast to the Lancashire witches, and it was often kind of just used to refer to the women. So in this sense that, you know, it's, I guess that witches could be beautiful and alluring, and I guess kind of also going back to this idea of the sirens. I mean, one thing that I'm kind of fascinated about in it is, did women see themselves in this kind of line of like working women that go from the kind of Pendle witches, who, like I say, were kind of mostly, apart from Alice Nutter, quite poor women that used what little power they had, and got one over on the magistrates by doing that for some time. Or yeah, did they kind of see a lineage of themselves through there?
Or even like, sorry to interrupt, but just that idea of reclaiming as well, because it's obviously something that me and Anna are doing a lot of talking about, and a lot of work around that idea of reclaiming those tropes, and even like we've talked about a few times about the Bell Alliance, where they're wearing breeches, and you're like, well, yeah, that's entirely practical, but like, you know, like, was there any sense of those things being things that people wanted to reclaim, or was it just too close to the bone? Was it just too defamatory?
I think they were actively trying to, if not reclaim them, then kind of refute them. So particularly around the Edmund Burke kind of referring to poor people as swine.
It's just frozen.
Seemed to be something that really hit home. There's a lot of kind of reference to swine. Yeah, so there's a kind of sense that they were kind of actually really offended by some of the stuff that was levelled against them and actively trying to refute it. Women also kind of seem to counter this kind of Thomas Malthus's idea that the poor shouldn't be having families if they can't support them, and that seems to be something that really kind of gets people's back up. So you get the sense that they are kind of responding to things. So if not reclaiming them and trying to kind of repurpose them or kind of disprove them. I think again a lot of this kind of domestic imagery is kind of countering the notion that poorer people are sort of undifferentiated swine, or just, you know, it's kind of showing their finer feelings, showing their humanity as well.
Yeah.
Oh, it's really freezing.
I couldn't work out whether that was me or whether that was Ruth.
Are you still there, Ruth? Just on that point,
still here, but it is freezing a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, you're still here, that's a good thing.
Yeah, because I was just going to bring up on that same point about the witches as well, that you'd written about in your original essay, that at Hunt's birthday party, they'd used the toast that said they use their spells to comfort and redress the wrongs of men, which was just a really nice kind of like idea that they're actually kind of saying like, these women are witches.
Yeah, it's a really nice kind of reversal of the kind of idea of the witch, and kind of that I guess is a reclaiming. That is a kind of we're gonna take this. But I'm really interested in how kind of Lancashire women have sort of had this kind of radical past and how they kind of have used it through time. So obviously kind of after this you get the suffragettes, and, you know, on into kind of weaver women. There's a really great novel by a Blackburn writer, Ethel Carney Holdsworth, and she has this line that as kind of radical working women we have a tradition behind us, and I really like that there's kind of this drawing on a sort of sense of history and tradition. So I would quite like to think that the female reformers were kind of harking back to some extent to the Pendle witches as well.
Somebody just mentioned that as Charles Rigby spoke of Lee women, I think perhaps Lee female reformers were attractive, whereas traditionally in Shakespeare, etc., the witches were crones. So perhaps that's that similar thing, that the Lancashire association with witches is something that's kind of like, you know, radical and it's associated with beauty, whereas like maybe the kind of somewhere else it was considered to be the crone.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess that, or this kind of idea that there's the kind of two sides to women. They could be the kind of violent, malevolent crone, or they could be the attractive siren, and that could also be threatening as well as.
Yeah, because I think there's the whole like Lancashire beauty, isn't there? Just full stop, taking the witch out of that, and like you say about bewitching, there's like a power and an evil and a something at play there as well, isn't it? In beauty, is something that can be considered quite dangerous.
Yeah, and even as you get onto kind of representations of mill girls, you kind of get this sort of sense that either mill girls were kind of so ground down by the work, or were kind of like stunningly beautiful and potentially kind of sexually dangerous as well, particularly because they're often able to be economically independent. So there's this kind of sense that there's something there about the kind of independence of Lancashire women that kind of is a thread through the 19th century.
It's a real weird mistrust of women, isn't it?
I was just asked if you could just say the name of the author again, the Blackburn author.
Yeah, I'll type it into the chat because then it'll be people can copy it down if they need to. I'll just do that quickly.
Yeah. And then we just got another question from the group. So Andrea Davis has asked, was the Female Reform Society just an English working class, or did women from other countries support them?
So there were Scottish societies as well. I don't know about Welsh ones, but there possibly were. My research has mostly been on Lancashire, but they were all over the country. So the Lancashire ones were first, but they did get them in kind of Scotland and kind of throughout the country later on. There's also kind of links to Ireland at this point. So one of the big fears is that because there's the Irish Rebellion in, I think, is that 1798? So there's kind of a sense that Ireland is a threatening place just across the sea as well. And obviously there's a lot of Irish immigration to Lancashire. So there's kind of ideas that there's radical connections there. So I guess there's possibly kind of sympathy there. After Peterloo as well, there's also kind of correspondence with radicals in America. And indeed some kind of radicals did emigrate to America because of the kind of persecution that they faced. So there is kind of international connections as well as kind of within the nation. And yeah, I think kind of female reformers might particularly have kind of felt sympathy with one another. So the radical journalist Richard Carlile was imprisoned for blasphemy, and his wife was also imprisoned for kind of continuing to sell his works after he was imprisoned. And there was a lot of kind of women sending things to her. So the female reformers specifically kind of made her things like baby booties and sent them. So there's kind of solidarity between women there as well.
I'm going to ask a question. We just recently spoke to, we did like a little recorded interview that we'll be putting out at some point, probably after Christmas. It was to a local political activist who has received online abuse primarily for using her voice in a political sphere. She talks about how local women in power and politics had suffered and even left their positions feeling a very real threat from people opposed to women speaking out in this way. And we're talking like on Twitter and social media, this kind of thing. Do you think the female reformers would...
And actually physically as well in some cases, so...
Yeah, face to face. Do you think the female reformers would have similarly felt this level of threat and intimidation? I know you did talk about intimidation from both sides, but yeah, like, just thinking about like that kind of that resistance that women would have to both put up with and like go through.
Yes, I think kind of the sort of abuse that female politicians quite often get today, and other kind of female kind of people in the public eye get today, is kind of very similar in some ways to what the female reformers were getting. It's this sort of sense that you're sort of stepping beyond what people want you to do, the box that people want to put you in. I think they would have felt quite worried about it. I mean, if nothing else, there's no welfare state if your boss doesn't like your politics, and either kind of sacks you or refuses to kind of take your weaving in or whatever. You're kind of in a bit of a mess. Likewise, kind of if you are kind of going to the parish for any sort of relief, that's going to be kind of dependent on your good behaviour. And this is why I think the numbers at Peterloo were probably underestimated, because a lot of people would have tried to keep it quiet. There's this threat of physical harm. Obviously, they kind of experienced that at Peterloo, but while you've got kind of like the military parading in the streets, there's always a sense that perhaps if you're thought of as a traitor, you're in physical danger. So yeah, I think there would be. And also, it's just kind of not particularly nice to get this constant kind of barrage of attacks on your character. I mean, a lot of these were kind of married women, and then to kind of have the suggestion that they were kind of sexually being inappropriate, the kind of the attacks on their reputation would have been probably quite hurtful, I think.
Were they feeling that, you think, on a kind of one-on-one level? So like obviously now like people kind of get direct abuse on spaces like Twitter, where people are messaging them, or sliding into the DMs and telling them horrible things, or they're like like obviously it's like they might be jeering at them in public. But if a lot of this stuff's coming through in other pamphlets and stuff like that, it's got a slight abstraction to the individual, like Mary or whatever is just there. She's not kind of like seeing it all necessarily directly at her, or was she? Was the individual person getting jeered at on the street?
Yeah, there were jeerings. Like there's a report of jeering before, like on the way into Peterloo.
That's like when they're marching. I mean, that's when they're sort of actively out and about.
Yeah.
But like they're kind of living their sort of life, like down at the market or whatever, were people shouting at them then, speaking to them individually?
There's not, I've not really found anything of that apart from these kind of public jeerings when they're out and about, and I wonder if that's partly just because fewer women have kind of written down their stories. I mean, one of the things that must have been quite shocking at Peterloo was that a lot of them knew the people that were attacking them. So the Manchester Yeomen were kind of drawn from the local community as well. So I think one of the people that was attacked kind of said, like, mate, I know your mums, I know what you're doing. And it's kind of, you get the sense that was particularly shocking for people to be kind of attacked by members of their own community. But yeah, I don't know how much is recorded of people's just kind of someone maybe just hissing at you in the market, or maybe just leaving something outside your door or whatever, because there were these kind of community disciplinary actions that went on. Samuel Bamford talks quite a lot about kind of like tying twigs to someone's door to signal something about them and that sort of thing.
Like all that kind of public shaming ritual stuff that's that's kind of a bit older as well, because it's hinted at in like with our banners that we're doing, the cuckolding banner that's in the background, but a lot of that was leaving sort of like sort of things on people's doorsteps or stuff that's a kind of old folk version of public shaming.
Yeah, and this kind of sense that you're kind of trying to enforce community norms. So I guess if you were in a community that didn't agree with you, it would probably be quite uncomfortable. I mean, Katrina Navickas has done a little bit of kind of mapping work on kind of where radicals lived, and she found that a lot of them did live in kind of Ancourt, so perhaps people tended to live near people that were kind of like-minded. But you would kind of hope so for their sake, because I imagine if you're like walking down the street and somebody disagrees with you, it might well be unsettling, especially if they could report you to the police. It would be.
It's amazing that these societies existed. I know there was a lot to gain, but there was a hell of a lot to lose, especially for the women involved. It just shows you the kind of like it kind of, in a way, it can help you understand the military nature of what they were saying, because it's not something that you would do lightly. So the kind of language that they were using seems appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, you can see why they'd be angry. And I guess probably what helped sustain it was the sort of sense of community. So perhaps that's part of the reason that they did decide to form groups, to have this sort of female community as well. So a lot of them were kind of married to radical men. But you do you might also want your kind of sisterhood around you as well, and particularly when a lot of the male leaders were in prison. So it's not something that's kind of talked about a huge amount, but a lot of the women must have really struggled financially when their husbands went into prison, because again, there wasn't a welfare state, and you wouldn't really be able to go to anyone for help because your husband's in prison for treasonous activity or whatever. So you do feel like a lot of them, I mean, fortunately, if you're a Lancashire woman, you could probably turn your hand to a bit of weaving, but there's still it could have really kind of material detriment to your life. But Jemima Bamford does talk at one point, or no, Samuel Bamford talks about Jemima Bamford going to another kind of radical family for help, and them kind of treating her kindly and stuff. So I guess you get this sort of sense of a community under pressure, and kind of looking after your group as well.
Yeah, that is amazing. We've got one last question. I don't know, Anna, have you got any questions from the chat?
Just that if there's a chance that we could perhaps list other references for further research, but that's not a kind of direct question. So I think, just go ahead and ask that one. I'll browse up and see if I've missed any whilst you ask that.
Okay, I'm conscious that we have run a bit over, but it's just too interesting. So Anna and I are both developing work around the ideas that you've spoken about in regards to the performance of power by the reformers and their subversion and reclamation of the symbols of power, such as ensigns and militaristic performance. Where in their daily lives would the reformers have encountered the symbols of power that they sought to claim? So public monuments and brushes with the military, like as examples, really. I know that you did mention, like you did talk about in the talk, the those performances of power that that like the loyalist kind of performances of power that happened with the voluntary militia, but I wondered if there was other, where else would that have happened? Where else would they have been familiar with that kind of language and that kind of symbolism?
So I think this is kind of a really interesting point in terms of what's going on with industry, and I'm kind of reluctant to put too much of a class analysis onto it, because I think there's not all of the working class were radicals and so on, but a lot of these kind of middle class factory owners were just starting to get power to kind of build these big buildings, and also kind of then later sort of civic monuments and things. So there's kind of like the built structure of your city would start to kind of reflect your lack of class power, perhaps. And if you kind of think about the huge changes that started to go on around Lancashire at this time, so things like canals being dug, there's just, there's quite a lot kind of going on. So I think there's this kind of sort of sense of your economic power is enshrined in the landscape. In terms of sort of particularly things that would be against the radicals, there was quite a lot of this sort of public display. There's these kind of Paine burnings, which often kind of took place in kind of symbolic sort of heart of the village, things like that. And actually in the Queen Caroline, she was acquitted at the end of her trial, and the radicals kind of retook over all of these spaces and kind of had celebrations in the spaces where Tom Paine was burnt. So you get the sense that they were very aware that these streets were being kind of taken from them, and they were taking them back. I guess there's also like the pulpit is a kind of key area where your kind of role in society was reinforced. And there's a lot of kind of very moralizing sermons. I mean, there was also kind of radical preachers. There's Reverend Schofield, who was kind of one of the kind of key ones in the Manchester area, who, he was kind of central to this kind of baptizing ritual where you're kind of naming children after figures. And I guess there's things like these big kind of military celebrations and jubilees as well, around the kind of the King's Jubilee and the coronation and that sort of thing. So there's all these sort of loyal celebrations that go on in public space too. I think it would be kind of this kind of incremental thing as well. There's kind of various different things going on at the same time. So you'd maybe get the kind of compounding of the sort of sense that you were maybe not the powerful one in this scenario.
I think that's really interesting as well that you said that that kind of civic monuments and stuff are only just starting to go up. I think that's really kind of like fascinating that these sort of like markers of authority are only quite new in quite a lot of places.
And that idea of that middle class, that growing sort of the middle class kind of gaining that more power and through industry, so that kind of changing the landscape of towns. I mean, we've looked at the obelisk in Lee. That's something that we've been looking at, and it is around that time, wasn't it?
The original obelisk wasn't that old when they, but I hadn't really thought about actually the fact that it was so new, but it was so new, wasn't it? But yeah, the obelisk was where they had their Lee meeting in on August the 11th. Not in the exact location that it's in now, because it's moved around a little bit. It's wandering obelisk, but
you get this sense that these same places have kind of symbolic value and get reused. So things like the town pump. I can't remember which town it's in, but there's like one town where suspected Jacobins get kind of like doused under the town pump as a form of humiliation, and then they decorate it as this kind of form of celebration when Queen Caroline gets acquitted. So it's this constant kind of contestations over spaces, and I think St Peter's Fields is one of them as well that kind of keeps getting this sort of space contestations. There's various places that get this sort of symbolic resonance and keep getting reused again, that are quite important.
I've just realised, I think that one of the people who's asking questions, I think it must be Yvonne. It's 665084. So she's just said that the Thomas Paine effigy that was burned in Lee, and the coals and cannels cost 6 shillings and 6 pence.
I wonder where that was then. I wonder whether that was on Civic Square in Lee.
Was that on Civic Square, Yvonne, where the Thomas Paine effigy was burned? Let's burn an effigy, Helen.
I know.
You could have a bonfire. But yeah, they did the Tom Paine burnings in a lot of places, and in a lot of places the kind of like Lord of the Manor type person provided the beer and the kind of the coals and that sort of thing. So you get a sense that the kind of upper classes are supporting this.
Yeah.
And it's also in terms of kind of like growing middle class power, it's the sort of time when you start to get all these kind of social observers reports as well. There's all these kind of statistics coming out about the ideal budget for a working class family and stuff like that. So it's the sense that all your kind of traditions and things are kind of being glossed over for the sake of, you know, what you should be doing, which seems very resonant to me today when you kind of see people talking about the period products and people going like, oh, but you can get a pack of tampons for 60p, and it's like, yeah, great. If I don't have 60p, that's no good to me, is it? So yeah,
like, you should be able to afford that.
Yeah.
So we've just got to half past. So we've got one last question from Kirsty, which I think is a really brilliant one to end on, actually. And it's do you feel that they felt that they won the argument?
I think they felt they won the moral argument. It's hard to tell how they would have felt at the time, because obviously reform was such a gradual process. I mean, you don't even get the first Reform Act until 1832, and then obviously for like working class people that's into the 1860s, so most of them wouldn't have lived to see it. But yeah, I think they felt they won the moral argument, because the authorities were kind of provoked into attacking them, and that kind of undermined any claim they had to be kind of protectors of the vulnerable, and in particular kind of like this idea that the king was kind of this benevolent patriarch. I mean, that's completely undermined by the attacks on civilians, which then kind of the king went on to celebrate. So well, it's the Prince Regent at that point. He becomes the king the following year. So
then also, like you said about the Queen Caroline stuff as well, that, you know, like he's not a benevolent patriarch when he's so awful to his own wife.
Yeah, and that really turned people against him. I think Queen Caroline really got quite a following.
If they're believing that the French were immoral to allow, you know, to kind of like be so pro-divorce or whatever, and then the then king is kind of like being like that with his wife.
That's his wife.
Becomes a
and as I think Yvonne's just pointed out in the chat, that obviously some women, depending on kind of your property ownership and things, could vote before it was kind of formalised that you wouldn't. So it's only kind of traditional that women wouldn't vote before 1832, and it was to do with property more than anything else. But yeah, that kind of formalised that women couldn't vote. So, I mean, in terms of women getting the vote, that's even later, isn't it? So, yeah, although that wasn't what they were asking for mostly. So.
But I just wonder as well if, like, I was reading the essay, but I don't know his first name. I think it might be Michael, but M.L. Bush. I don't know his first name, but his article, his essay on female reformers, and he kind of suggests that that whilst the male reformers kind of didn't come out that well, the female reformers kind of did. Like they gained a lot from the whole thing, and I wonder whether that is around confidence in political, like I suppose they gained certain amount of legitimacy in political matters because the authorities were terrified, and that action sort of played out. I just wonder whether they had like a confidence in that political activism and that like action, and whether that carried on.
Yeah, it's a really good point that I mean, they're getting this experience of speaking in public and of organising, and they're getting, there's all these kind of skills involved in organising and kind of raising subscriptions and that sort of thing. And I think they were quite crucial in kind of continuing to raise funds for, say, imprisoned radicals and things like that. And I guess there's also the fact that they have got on the kind of political stage this idea that the domestic matters, kind of the personal is political, to kind of put it anachronistically. But that, that it's a very early example of that, of sort of saying, our everyday experience is a political issue.
But then it's also, because it's I think it was actually in one of the Hansards. So it was I don't know if it was in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, but one of the politicians did actually kind of remind the house they were in that it isn't that new that women would head up things because of like bread riots and like things like that women had been heading up before.
And said about friendly societies as well, and like the formation of that.
Yeah, so there's quite Yvonne's new article about that kind of mentions the friendly societies, and yeah, this is an early form of political organisation. Well, sort of, sometimes it was a cover for political organisation, sometimes it was kind of a trade thing. But yeah, there's a lot of evidence of women organising before this. Samuel Bamford mentions 2 women in a Luddite riot as well, food riots they were quite often involved in. And there are also quite a lot of these women, I mean, we've talked about them in kind of domestic terms today, but a lot of them would have been workers, some of them in the early factories as well, so especially around Manchester, coal mining as well. So, they weren't necessarily kind of shrinking violets. They might well have, been able to, contend with quite a rough workplace as well.
That's amazing. Anna, do you want to ask any more questions?
I think,
I don't know whether there's any more to ask.
Just Yvonne saying that women organised well before the female reformers, with evidence in late of women organising. Really, but yeah. No, I think there's so much more.
We could talk all day, let's face it. It's such a fascinating subject, and it's just
over. So yeah, thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you
for
the project and for inspiring it and giving it its title and everything that we're making.
Thank you for responding to it, because honestly it's so nice to sort of see that people have kind of read something that I've written and kind of taken things from it and done something amazing with it. So yeah, I'm absolutely thrilled. Thank you everybody for coming as well, and I guess if people want that list of references, we can kind of put that together somehow. I can send something to you, but you've obviously kind of done your own kind of archival research as well, so
it would be great, Ruth, actually, if you could do that. And we have recorded this session today, so we'll be putting it on the Turnpike website at a later date, so we can maybe incorporate some of the references at the end.
Brilliant. And I'll send the slides with references to where they are as well, so that people can kind of re-look at those.
That's fabulous.
And just to end off as well, we've got one ongoing activity that we're just doing during lockdown, and it'll be over Christmas as well. So if you go onto the Turnpike Instagram at the Turnpike Lee, is it?
It's just at the Turnpike, I think. Oh, I'll just check.
Great.
You
So
carry on and
just,
I'll check.
just pop it into the chat for everyone, but the link is. But if you find the Turnpike in Instagram, we're asking people to make their own witchy sigil, which is to create an intention of something that you wish to have, be, own, whatever you want, feel. You write that out as though you have it. Then there's a process to turn that into a symbol. So Hannah's just put in the thing too.
There we go. Thanks, Hannah.
So you can, if you can create your own sigil, this moment of empowerment, we will then charge it through further workshops and stuff. So you create a sigil that is your intention, and then we will magically charge it as part of our further work. So it'll be engraved into some of our artworks, it'll be woven by people, it might be made into emblems and medals by some children in later workshops when we start up. So all of your hopes, dreams and wishes will become will happen because of our project.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
And just to be aware, like, we have got more things to come out, more like little activities to engage with. As we speak, we're not quite sure when we're going to go back into the Turnpike, but if you want any information, you can email the Turnpike and get on our mailing list, and then we can like give you updates as to where we're up to, or you can follow the Turnpike on Instagram to find any more information. But just look out for us, because we're doing we've got a number of other performances that we're going to be putting out probably early next year. So yeah, we've got a few things.
And another textile workshop that people can do at home, which hopefully will be coming out in about a week's time. So you can make some pageantry at home and then send it in, so we can decorate our hustings with it as well in the new year.
So there's a lot of ways for you to get involved, and to just trying to make as much people part of our project as much as possible, and especially while we're not in there, which is devastating, but it's fine. We will be at some point. Thank you so much for coming. And Anna, I was going to suggest, I don't know whether you want to, have you saved the chat?
Oh, I don't know how to do that. Do I just press the file button?
I think it should.
Oh no, that's uploading a file, isn't it? Huh? What do I do?
Just before we come off. How do I do that? It doesn't matter if not. Anyway, thank you so much, Ruth, and thanks for everybody to come.
Thank you everyone for coming. It was great to speak to you all. Thank you for the questions too. Great questions.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay in touch.